Before European contact, an estimated 18 million indigenous people lived across North America. The modern map of the United States was carved out of that wilderness through a series of violent seizures and broken treaties. In the early colonial era, conflict was driven by immediate survival and trade alliances. These were localized struggles for territory, lacking a centralized plan for continental expansion. In 1783, following the American Revolution, Great Britain ceded the vast interior of the continent to the United States. Though tens of thousands of indigenous people already occupied this land, the U.S. government reclassified these sovereign nations as conquered enemies living on American soil. The 1783 treaty turned scattered frontier skirmishes into a unified national mandate. The United States would now push a hostile frontier line endlessly westward. This map shows the primary economic driver of the early 1800s. American settlers demanded the fertile lands of the Ohio Valley and the Deep South for massive agricultural expansion, forcing a rigid frontier line toward the Mississippi River. Native nations responded with unified resistance. Leaders like Tecumseh built pan-tribal coalitions to halt the advance, but these forces suffered critical defeats during the War of 1812, clearing the way for federal expansion. In 1830, the United States government codified ethnic cleansing into law. The Indian Removal Act provided the legal framework for the mass deportation of native tribes from their ancestral homelands. The Army forced thousands of people west of the Mississippi River into designated Indian territory. This mass relocation, including the Cherokee's Trail of Tears, was conducted under harsh conditions that claimed thousands of lives through exposure and disease. Resistance to this policy carried a heavy military cost. In Florida, the Second Seminole War turned into a protracted 7-year guerrilla conflict, becoming the most expensive war the U.S. Army had ever waged against indigenous people. By the 1840s, federal law and military force were synchronized into a single machine. The entire eastern seaboard was being cleared for agricultural commerce. The boundary of Indian Territory was shattered by two major events, the 1849 Gold Rush and the Homestead Act. These brought hundreds of thousands of settlers into the West, each claiming land the government had previously promised to native nations. These settlers constructed permanent dwellings like this sod house, aggressively claiming the resources of the Great Plains and disrupting the nomadic life of the tribes living there. Industrialization accelerated the collapse of the frontier. The Transcontinental Railroad physically severed hunting grounds and allowed the U.S. military to move men and supplies with incredible speed. The U.S. Army took on a new directive, deploying cavalry units to actively protect the miners and railroad workers. This triggered the most aggressive military conflicts of the era, including the Comanche, the Apache campaigns, and the Sioux Wars. Sitting Bull, a brilliant tactical leader of the Lakota, spearheaded the defense of the northern plains. He organized a coalition of warriors that represented the peak of indigenous military resistance. In 1876, at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, Sitting Bull's forces completely destroyed the 7th Cavalry under George Custer. This catastrophic defeat of U.S. forces temporarily halted the American advance. In the Southwest, Apache leaders like Geronimo led a fiercely independent resistance. They utilized the rugged mountain terrain to evade thousands of U.S. troops, marking some of the final military holdouts against the American expansion. These tactical victories were ultimately overmatched by the sheer scale of the invasion. Against the military's industrial supply lines and a relentless influx of population, indigenous resistance was mathematically doomed. By the late 1880s, the federal government shifted its policy toward total subjugation. Native nations were confined to shrinking, highly controlled reservations, where their movements and resources were strictly limited by the Army. This policy of containment ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. While attempting to disarm a Lakota camp, U.S. soldiers slaughtered up to 300 civilians, leaving their bodies in the snow. This chart shows the scale of the collapse. The indigenous population, once estimated at 18 million, dropped to roughly 250,000 by the 1890 census. This was the cumulative result of war, disease, and the destruction of traditional food sources. The modern map of the United States is the physical record of this century-long military campaign. These borders are the direct result of systemic displacement and conquest.